Okay, thanks. Welcome everybody, great to see so many fine smiling faces, and largely everybody's here on time. And what I'm going to offer you today is to see the inner development goals within a leadership frame. So I've been sort of one of the early adopters of the inner development goals, promoting them in the Netherlands and getting the knowledge of them more widespread. But I've yet to come across anyone that's directly and explicitly linking the inner development goals to leadership. So we're kind of pioneering and feeling into what that might be today. But what I'm offering you is not the result of academics. Well, I've done some academic study, but it's not necessarily what I would say is a classical academic output. What I'm giving you is my benefits of my lived experience of leadership. So what I'm offering to you today is I'm inviting you to listen with an open heart and open mind, see what resonates and what feels true for you, and if that moves you enough, then potentially act upon that. But don't take this as some general rule that's true for everybody or whatever. It isn't. This is my lived experience. And so if it has truth and resonance for you, then take on board what you will. So if we can get the next slide. That was the introduction. A little bit about me, what brings me to this point to be presenting to you. I'm a Brit, as you can probably hear from my accent, and I was based in the UK, working with young people, your sort of age, for about 15 years, helping them develop independence in their lives. So you could say at that point in my life, I was driven by a passion and liberating the potential of young people. But young people often in unfortunate circumstances, without parental guidance, with problems they couldn't navigate on their own. But so I have an instinctive resonance and interest in seeing young people develop a thriving livelihood. So hopefully I can embed some of that in today's presentation. And I think actually I did have an exercise in mind, but given the size of the group and the fact that we've got chairs, I'm going to give you a little exercise just to get us into this topic, and I'd like you to turn to the person next to you. So find a second person to speak to.
Yeah.
So if you haven't got somebody, put your hand up, and then maybe people can find each other in that way. So if you're next to somebody you know well, I'd invite you to share one or two appreciations of them. So generally, we're very much on automatic a lot of the time. We like people, we know them. We don't really actually make our appreciation conscious. And also, if you work in an organisation and you work hard in an organisation, the degree of appreciation is often very lacking. So what I'd quite like you to do is to share with each other 2 or 3 things with your partner that you appreciate. So take a minute or 2 each, and then we'll come back into the main presentation. So
I can start. I would like to have some.
very good. I don't like to say shh, quiet down and all of that. So there was a lot of energy of appreciation in the room. So it was very loud, very energetic, and hopefully if much of our education had that degree of energy, maybe we would have transformed the education system also. Okay, so from what I understand, the Sustainable Development Goals are embedded in the way that Windesheim operates. But is there anyone here that's not familiar with them? Dead silence, that's quite important to the academic. Okay, so these are lovely visual representations of systemic issues across the planet. And if you go to the next slide, and most of you, is everybody working on familiar with the inner development goals or working on them in their course? Not so many. Stick your hand up if you're not. Okay, good. So we've got the Sustainable Development Goals and we've got the Inner Development Goals. If you go to the next slide, please, Maria. And these 5 domains break down into about 23 different indicators. And I would say my life's history is, if anything you hear today convinces you, it's because my life history has been devoted to this landscape, not to those specific elements, but it's been devoted to inner development, but also personal development in the work. If you work with young people that are challenged, you have to be emotionally intelligent, you have to be aware, and in order, you have to be able to be robust in the face of challenge. So my lived experience and what's coming out of me today is based on this investigation, a lifelong investigation into the inner landscape. But I'm going to present to you, it's not only going to be about the inward landscape today, but this territory I'm very familiar with. So can you move it on? And I want you to include this representation. You could say that the inner development goals is kind of box-like and separate, and each of the items are kind of their own unique thing, when what that visual doesn't represent is the interconnected relationships and the interdependencies between all of those systems. So this is the Kate Raworth's donut model, and what we've got on the outside in this circle here is the limits of Earth's capacity. So there's only so much lithium, there's only so much silicon, there's only so much iron, there's only so much other essential commons and resources that we can extract and use for our products and our modern daily life. So that's an ecological ceiling. In here are the kind of expression of many of the same elements that are in the inner development goals. And what we've got here in the red, and this is the kind of dire ecological emergency that we're in across the planet, is climate change is a huge threat. Biodiversity loss is almost beyond retrieval. Land is degraded, and also, as we've got quite prominent in the Netherlands, is this stickstoff or nitrogen and phosphorus problem with Earth. So these things are already exceeded almost what the Earth itself can regenerate. If everything stayed within this, the Earth would regenerate and recreate the resources itself if it was healthy. So inner development, against that picture, becomes far more critical than actually it's prominent in society and in education. So that makes your personal relationship to your own life critical. It could be critical, or it makes everybody's obligation on everybody to work on inner development, because this is the global picture. And so little news of, you get the kind of scientific messaging of the disaster most people are familiar with. However, how can one act in the face of massive overwhelming crisis where the species is threatened is the challenge of our time. So, and a personal challenge, a collective challenge, and a challenge in our ability to cooperate and at least hospice or diminish the footprint that we're having on the Earth. So, the next one. And what we saw with the inner development goals, sustainable development goals, and the donut are the kind of symptoms of what you could say is an inner crisis. And what's the inner crisis? Otto Scharmer puts it as the 3 divides: from self, self from nature, and self from each other. So had we better capacities across those 3 divides, we might be doing a little bit better in arresting some of the ecological decline. That's my proposition to you. So these 3 root causes, Otto Scharmer denotes about 8 or 10 critical systems which with the right kind of acupuncture. He uses acupuncture as a metaphor of making systems change. However, leadership he's got in there as in a collective paralysis, being a state of collective paralysis. How many people feel we've got the leadership across our planetary systems to take us to another level or a healthier planet? Okay, so that's an indication something, there's a big failure in all our systems. And also, I think, this is the root causes. This is my proposition to you. These are the root causes of it. Go to the next slide. So, one of the ways I'm framing the leadership for you to think about leadership today is to think of it as nested. So, a nested system, nature is made up of nested systems. If you think of your own body and the way the body works, they're system within system, and they all creates the greater whole that is you, that's sitting on the chair listening. You are a product of a nested system, and you sit within this system here in this classroom. It's for a particular gathering for a day, but then you've got different groups that you're studying with, or you've got different courses you're doing. Those are social systems, and then the university is a social system, and then the university sits within the Netherlands and the wider global. So everything, human activity, is nested, and this starts to address the lack of interconnection that you see in the Sustainable Development Goals, and to some degree even the inner development framework. So think about leadership as being nested, as being situated, as being a living entity. So my wife was having me try and not be so nervous in the car, so I talked to her about what I was going to put in my presentation. And I came to this slide, and then I realised, actually, I can explain to you in a very simple way, without referring to what's on the slide, about what if it's something, if it's irreducible. So if you think of water, you can chemically analyse water, and it's 3 elements, if I remember my chemistry correctly. 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen. You can measure the flow of water. You can measure the volume of water. You might be able to look at the ecosystemic capacities of water, or the biological entities that live in water. But does that describe the experience of being wet? So what I'm pointing to, so I would say the experience of being wet is irreducible to any of those disciplines. You can't reduce the experience of water or the experience of being wet to any particular discipline. And especially not your personal experience of being wet. It might be different to someone else's. So I like you to encourage you to think of leadership as being irreducible. And if you think of that, then your attitude and approach and ability to meaningfully engage with the subject will improve. You have that next one. So Sharma talks about leadership paralysis. Nobody in the room thought there was any visible leadership that was taking us in a different direction. So, and also, I did my master's dissertation. I looked at the lived experience of leadership developers, and it was prominent then and now. Most programs that try and operationalize and say you need to be authentic, you should do A, B, C, and D, or to be a more inspiring leader, you should do this. Most of them fail. The large percentage of them fail because they're operationalizing something, trying to operationalize and translate into something technical, something that's actually natural. So leadership is irreducible because it's part of your lived experience. It's enacted in your body in real time with others. And once you try and extract those into different variables and measure them, you end up with something pretty meaningless and something that is difficult to grow, a difficult area to grow. So when I talk about leadership, how many people think of themselves as not being a leader? Well, nobody wants to. Okay, who thinks? Okay, so some of you might think, well, that's just not naturally who I am. And I want to encourage you to think about leadership in a different way. I want to encourage you to think about leadership not about status, position, power, earnings, skills, job title, which are the commonly accepted conventions around what the form of leadership. And I would say there's a form of leadership predicated on inner development that is always now, that if it's relating to the global context, you're thinking more broadly than most humans in some ways, because we're so preoccupied with our immediate survival a lot of the time. It's always embodied. You need to be self-aware. And my suggestion to you is, if you have a wish or a desire to make positive change in the world, and you're willing to act, that is de facto leadership, whether you're getting the position, the pay, the recognition, or the reward. That's de facto leadership. So, getting on to the idea of self-awareness, Socrates talked about, in ancient Greek times, talked about the unexamined life is a life not worth living. So he's pointing to the rich landscape of inner development. But also it's also having a sustained curiosity, an open-minded interest, longing and yearning for adventure and exploration, which in your studies, that is part of the core driver that we've brought you into the room today, but into the field of university, exploring elements like inner development goals, empathy, emotional intelligence. These are often the intrinsic drivers, but they're not often made that conscious or that wouldn't say rewarded, but emphasised, not necessarily emphasised as much as they could be. So if we move to the next slide. So also an aspect of leadership that is dependent on inner development is this phrase from Bill O'Brien that Otto Scharmer uses quite a lot. It's called the success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. Now, if you do any organisational studies or research of what happens in organisations, I think only a very 20 to 25% of organisational change strategies are successful. And partly that's because most organisations are existing in a mechanical paradigm. They think there's an assumption that everything moves logically and rationally to the next step. They have wonderful logical, rational strategies, but underlying it, what's missed is the messiness and complexity of human behaviour and human relations. So this is where I think O'Brien is talking to the more conscious a leader you are, the better chance of success. I don't think that every conscious leader or anybody that's got a good interior development, level of development, will necessarily always be successful. There's some circumstances which just could be impossible, but I think it gives them a better chance of success. So that's why the inner development framework is pointing in this direction. It's orientated in this direction. The inner development goal framework is pointing in this direction. So I think I've made this point enough that the global circumstances, the fact that leadership is independent of role, position or status, and if you've got a heartfelt desire to change the world, that, in my book, starts to make you a leader. So if we move to the next one. So in my world, I do leadership development training, and I situate leadership as an art and a practice. So if you look at possibly one of the greatest musicians ever to have lived, the cellist Pablo Casal, he was asked, why did he continue to practice at age 90? Because he thinks he was making progress. This is an expert encapsulation of humility, which is very rare in most of our organisational systems and very rare behaviour. And in fact, we might be seen to be a behaviour that interferes with your ability to succeed in the world. But here is a great musician that has not given up on practicing. So my proposition to you is, with leadership being a phenomena enacted in place, if you turn it into an art and a practice and think of it in that way, your journey of leadership is never going to end. It's endless. If the greatest master of the cello, possibly ever to have lived, still practicing, then there's no end point in sight. But also, that's a key to improvement of your social, spiritual, and developmental character. So, see these qualities. Most of these qualities, I think, maybe not critical thinking, I would say, are also irreducible. Take one, and if you were to dive deep on it, you'd end up starting to connect to all the others. So rather than like flutter through and taste this and taste that or try that, commit yourself to one, understanding it, learn it, go into it deeply, study the field, study the greatest thinkers, the people that are luminaries in that particular area, and study it. And by going deeply and by sensing into the interconnection of all things in the donut and also here in the framework, I would say over time, leadership will be your natural self-expression. You don't need to think about position, role, or whatever, because you're leading yourself through being deeply committed, full-heartedly to something other that's irreducible. Your standing in the world in your own being will strengthen, and your ability to affect others will also enlarge. So, we're pretty much on time. So, if you were, my recommendation to you to start off, what you're going to be doing today with the two teams is practicing today. You're going to be playing games or entering little quizzes or interactions that illustrate the inner development goals in practice in a playful and enjoyable way. Because if there's no joy in it, why do it? We need joy, and we need joy in as much joy in education as possible. So what I recommend if there's something that you're attracted to in the inner development goals, or it could be beauty, it could be truth, it could be goodness, or it could be any kind of other human phenomena, just dive deeply, but make a practice. Carve out 5 or 10 minutes a day and see that through. So it's a metaphysical muscle. Without exercise, it doesn't improve. So if you exercise that muscle and you do it regularly, over time, it starts to imprint your being. And in imprinting your being, your whole way of relating to the world can change. But it can start from the very smallest step, but it needs continuous commitment and enactment. And in doing that, you build your faith in yourself. So, for example, some of the spiritual exploration I did with others, and we had regular meditation practices day and night. We did retreats, we did all kinds of things, and that imprinted something on me that's not left me now. It doesn't leave me, because when it's real, when it's in reality, and it relates to some core essence of life, it never goes away. But it's your dedication that breaks through, and your commitment that breaks through the barriers that get in the way of you doing that. So if we move to the next one now, Maria. So, and one of these things is maybe you choose something and it doesn't necessarily work the first time. Then it's a kind of iterative process of finding something that works for you. And clues that could be, you could have a gift or a talent or a yearning. You might even have a yearning to do something or to be something, often the way that the world works is you can sideline that because you need to survive, or you have expectations from people around you. You do a specific thing, but there could be an untapped yearning in your heart that actually, if you followed that could be the thing. Or it could be a gift, and if it's a gift, I'd recommend practice that regularly, because the more positive flow states you enter over time, this builds a coherence in your character and your identity that then transcends circumstances. You can have that confidence in life because you've broken through the kind of ordinary barriers that prevent you from doing that. You can think of yourself as your childhood dreams or wishes. What was it that you, as a child, dreamed of doing or being? Or it could be that points to a latent capacity that you could develop. So there's just different ways of exploring this landscape to create a virtuous circle, self-reinforcing, iterative circle that focused on inner development, that builds your capacity. And you are urgently needed. Every single person on this planet that is conscious and awake is urgently needed, so we can work together consciously to shift the destructive pathway that we're on as a species. So, last one. So, if you're curious about me and my work, I've got a free workbook on my website, which you can, if you're willing to share your email, on my website you can download. And I also run different programs at the moment. I'm redesigning some of them, but you can find my leadership program there. So before we finish, have we got time for a couple of questions? Or? Yeah. Thanks. Okay. Well, I'd love to invite you to any questions you might have, or thoughts even about what you've seen or heard today, just to round up. Speaking up in a big crowd, that's one of those lived experiences of leadership, that actually by taking a risk and being courageous, you can demonstrate it for yourself. And through doing that in different situations, that's how you also grow your inner capacities. I'm that intimidating, am I? I'm that scary. Okay. Yes, please.
Can you tell something about your own personal story of your own development of leadership?
I did that very briefly in the beginning.
Oh, I was not there. I'm so sorry.
I said I worked 25 years with young adults and young people that were struggling. So I actually before that I worked in handyman stuff. I thought I'll be a rebel and not do anything academic. And then I found actually none of my talents suited that, and I was actually more suited to working with people. So I found a passion 30 years ago of I was really, really into helping young people. So I was lucky. I found a profession that I never was scared to get up every day and go to work. And I loved interacting with young people, the unexpectedness, the aliveness, some of the ones I was with, randomness and weirdness also, but of many, many dimensions of life in working with young people. And alongside that, I was doing a whole spiritual and personal exploration of inner development, which involved being in communities, doing retreats, doing shared inquiry into spiritual issues. So I could take anything on the spiritual development, on the inner development framework, and we could go into it really deeply together, because I've done that collectively with people. So, and also I studied for my MA leadership development, but I spoke to people who weren't doing it in the conventional way. And I discovered some truths back then that weren't in the mainstream literature. I think since a lot more has happened, but back then there were a number of things that really the mainstream literature didn't highlight. Does that help?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. Right. Anyone else? Yes.
My question is still a bit blurry.
Yeah.
But to which extent is the IDG framework necessary for leadership, or is it more human wisdom in the end?
Well, that's an interesting question. I like the inner development framework because it at least gives people that are working in that field a more common framework language. So you could be doing NLP, or you could be doing transactional analysis, or you could be doing a number of developmental ways and work. And you might not even be telling people you're using it in an organization because the organization is not very hospitable to that. But it gives a common language, an agreed language, a scientifically researched language to use in organizations. And also, for example, you're never going to get to the bottom of a open learning mindset. You can cultivate that the whole of your life. So I like the open-endedness of the framework. And I would say to you, if you dedicate yourself passionately to any one of those, or discovering any one of those, the byproduct of that is your leadership. Don't necessarily consciously try to be a leader, or consciously make leadership something that's not you, but directly relate it to your own inner experience and make it a part of your world. Does that help? Yeah, okay. I think probably...
One more?
Yeah, one more.
I had a question, because how can you balance the individual view, but also the collective view? Because I really like the individual improvements, but then we also see in current society that we're also individually focused.
Yeah.
So how can you balance it between?
Well, I love that question, and I think that if you're really engaged in this is a constant question you need to revisit. I mean, even if you're in your learning group, there may be times that if you're taking the lead, you might have to step back so that the collective itself can function better, or it may be that you need to step in. So there's always that negotiation in the collective. But also, if you get in collectives, and I've been in collectives that have had a very strong mindset, then it's almost impossible to disrupt the power of the collective. It's impossible to disrupt or put your opinion across because the collective mindset is too strong. So there are dangers in there. But also, in the global circumstances, absolutely, we need unprecedented collaboration and cooperation, every system, every scale, and every field, to even begin to stop the crisis. That's the scale of the challenge. So how to be your best self in relationship is the core dynamic of this journey. So I don't have an answer, but I have a passion for discovering what comes along the way in response to that question. It's a really critical question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.